Ms Kieran.
My Lady, may I please call Sir Matthew Rycroft, CBE.
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
So Matthew, I hope you won't take it personally that most people seem to have cleared off.
That's fine by me.
Thank you. My Lady, I should state at the outset that this evidence session may be distressing to observers in that it includes discussion of the abuse of children, including through sexual abuse and violence. So Matthew, we understand that you served as the Permanent Secretary at the Home Office from the 23rd of March 2020 until March 2025. Is that right?
It is.
Thank you. So, Matthew, you have provided a witness statement for the inquiry on behalf of the Home Office. I think you have it in front of you, and the reference we have for it is INQ 000474944. So, Matthew, that is a detailed and wide-ranging statement, and we read from it that you have been assisted in its drafting by a number of officials in your department, so that where you do not have direct personal knowledge of all events covered in it, you are satisfied that you are nonetheless able to provide accurate evidence on behalf of the department. Is that right?
That's right, and I want to thank them very much for their support.
Thank you. And with that in mind, and noting that you signed it on the 18th of February 2025, can you please confirm that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can.
Thank you. We know, Sir Matthew, from that statement that the Home Office had responsibility for a number of issues that impacted children during the pandemic. And for our purposes today, those include responsibility for tackling all forms of child sexual abuse and sexual exploitation, including online abuse. Is that right?
That's right.
And responsibility for crime and policing that includes issues related to the physical abuse of children, violence against women and girls, and child criminal exploitation, such as county lines.
That's right.
And responsibilities also for child migrants, including unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. Is that right?
That's right.
Thank you. And is it right that a large part of that business would come into the portfolio of the Minister for Safeguarding, who for the first part of the pandemic was Victoria Atkins, and that some of it would have come into the portfolio of the Minister for Crime and Policing, who was Kit Malthouse?
That's right. And I should also mention the two different ministers for migration as well in relation to unaccompanied asylum-seeking children.
Thank you. So, Matthew, a theme that you return to several times in your statement, and which is also apparent in the exhibits you provided, is that to meet those responsibilities, the Home Office needed to work closely with other government departments. Most obviously, perhaps, there's an overlap, isn't there, between the Home Office's obligations relating to safeguarding children through the prevention of crime and the Department for Education's obligations for safeguarding through children's social work and schools. Is that right?
That's right. And there are lots of other government departments that the Home Office work very closely with in relation to preventing crime, and not just government, of course, the operational partners, policing being the most obvious, but also the voluntary sector, working very closely with a lot of non-governmental organisations and charities, tech companies, and multiple other partners.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you, Sir Matthew, please, to just slow down a little bit when you give your answers for the transcript. Given the importance of that work with other departments, would it be right to assume that prior to the pandemic, there were established mechanisms for cooperating, particularly with the Department for Education?
Yes. They came into their own during the pandemic, but they existed beforehand and, of course, continue to this day.
Thank you.
Some of them are sort of set in stone and are everlasting. Others can get created in order to deal with a particular situation.
Thank you. I think we'll come to explore some of that in a bit more detail. Can we look, please, at paragraph 49 of your statement? You said a moment ago that the Home Office liaises with a number of departments, and I think we see an illustration of that here. And we see, if we can please just scroll slowly down so that we're able to look at the range of these to paragraph 50, where we read that these shared responsibilities were established before 2020 and did not change because of the pandemic. So can we take it both in ordinary times and in the pandemic? Home Office officials are working very frequently on many different aspects of Home Office work relating to children across this wide range of departments.
Yes, that's absolutely right. The Department for Education would sort of be holding the ring, holding the sort of central policy responsibility, working very closely with the Home Office and other departments.
Thank you. And others that we see there, for example, are the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, and Department for Levelling Up, which I think we've been referring to as the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government. Were there established mechanisms for working with those departments as well, or did they tend to be ad hoc and project-based?
A mixture. In relation to the ringed departments, the DCMS and what was then DLUC, there were both sort of bilateral arrangements between the Home Office and each of those, and then multilateral arrangements involving a number of departments altogether.
Thank you, Sir Matthew. That can come down. We'll come back to explore how some of that worked during the pandemic in due course. If we can begin then thinking about March 2020, you will know, Sir Matthew, that some witnesses have suggested to the inquiry that there was a lack of focus on the implications of the pandemic for vulnerable children prior to the 18th of March across government. And in that context, can we please look at INQ 000518565? This is an internal Home Office email dated the 16th of May, beg your pardon, the 16th of March. And I think, Sir Matthew, noting as we did that you took up your role on the 23rd of March, please do let me know if any of my questions are outside of your knowledge about this. This email thread sets out what are described as takeaways on the Home Secretary's part following a COBRA meeting that day. If we can look, please, at that first paragraph, we read that the Home Secretary is concerned about vulnerable children not being taken into account properly by other government departments. She feels vulnerable people at the moment is taken to almost solely mean the elderly, pregnant women, and those with underlying health conditions. Her worry is that if schools are forced to close long-term, beyond normal holiday lengths, then there will be no external support and monitoring for kids from troubled homes, and we see in brackets drug abuse, CSE, etc. Secretary of State for Department for Education didn't really seem to take this on board, or at least didn't have a solid response to the challenge. Home Secretary wants the department to push DFE on taking this into consideration, and if necessary, we will lean in further via number 10, as she has strong thoughts on this issue. Would it be right then that the request to her officials arising from this is that Home Office officials should pick this up with officials from the Department for Education, and if that didn't allay concerns, then to pick it up further with number 10? Is that right?
That's absolutely right, and officials did follow up that instruction, of course, and so did the Minister who you've already referred to, Vicky Atkins. So she engaged very directly with her officer number in the Department for Education at ministerial level, bearing in mind the Home Secretary's and indeed, I think, the Home Office's strong concerns about what happens when schools are closed.
Thank you. Let's take that stage by stage then. Your first answer was that officials did pick that up with officials from the DFE. If we can scroll up, please, to page 1 of this document, we see what that feedback was when it was circulated within the Home Office. We see, in conjunction with SOCG colleagues, I may need your help at several points with these acronyms, Sir Matthew, but I think that is Serious Organised Crime Group colleagues. Thank you.
Correct.
We have been in contact with DFE at official level this morning. Broadly, they advise that there is significant activity being undertaken to protect vulnerable children from harm. So it seems that this level of detail hadn't been exposed or briefed to the DFE SOS before COBRA. Can we look then under the heading Summary as follows? I think I understand that this is what Department for Education officials were telling Home Office officials that they were doing on these topics. We see a wide range of actions in hand to support local authorities to deal with COVID-19 and ensure that vulnerable children are protected from harm. The examples given then are suspending routine Ofsted inspections, supporting LAs to ensure workforce contingencies are as comprehensive as possible, providing guidance to LAs to enable them to interpret Public Health England guidance, and the examples given in that respect are about isolation in children's homes, foster families or residential schools, a query about cocooning for vulnerable children, a query about protective clothing, and support in respect of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children who appear symptomatic. Now, Sir Matthew, if we can just remind ourselves that the concern the Home Secretary had been expressing was about whether if schools closed, there would be external support and monitoring for kids from troubled homes. And she specifically cited drug abuse and child sexual exploitation. Were these points that were being raised here in this email directly relevant to those issues?
Yes, I think they were relevant to those issues. And of course, the decision when it came to close schools was, of course, with the exception of vulnerable children. So
It
schools
was.
remain.
If I can just pause you there, this is, of course, the 16th and 17th, well, in fact, this is the 16th of March and the 17th of March. So before that decision was made.
Yes.
The points in this email, or the points coming back to the Home Office from the Department for Education, were not really about school closures. There isn't any indication here about vulnerable children being allowed to go to school.
I see what you mean, and I agree. I think these are points which the Department for Education told the Home Office in the week before, or in the run-up to the decision and announcement on schools being closed. So these were actions in hand in advance of any decision to close schools.
Yes. So I think my question is, given the specificity of the Home Secretary's concerns and the fact that these are not really going to the point of school closure, was this reassuring to the Home Office, or did the Home Office still have concerns that there was this gap that the Home Secretary had identified?
Well, I wasn't myself at the Home Office at that time, as you have said, but from reading the documents available in preparation for this inquiry, I can tell that the ongoing concern of the Home Secretary and the Home Office was that DFE needed to do more than they were doing in order to protect vulnerable children. That was an ongoing concern, and this bit of feedback in response to one moment in time, an instruction from the Home Secretary, was just a one-off. There would have been multiple other engagements at official and ministerial level between the two departments.
Yes, thank you. I think we'll come to some of those other instances. Just staying with this particular moment in time for now, the reason I ask this question about the 17th of March is because we have heard from other witnesses that the Department for Education had not undertaken any planning or assessment related to the implications specifically of school closures prior to the 17th of March. And it seems from this email chain that by the 16th of March, the Home Office had started to probe some of those issues. And I'm wondering whether the response perhaps revealed some gaps in that planning that caused any alarm in the Home Office, given that overlap for safeguarding children.
Well, what I can say is that the Home Office's concern, the Home Secretary's concern in general, was not fully met by this set of responses, and so we continued. The Home Office continued to engage with the Department for Education at all levels to make our concerns clear. And the reason that we had concerns was that we knew what happened to levels of domestic abuse, to levels of child sexual exploitation when schools are closed, because that's what's happened in every holiday. And you can see from the crime trends that there are upticks in relation to those sorts of crimes when children are not going to school.
And given the Home Office had that knowledge and that school closures clearly were very much on the table at this stage, can you help us to understand this? It's also clear from your statement that the Home Office had not itself conducted any planning or impact assessment about the possible implications for school closure on vulnerable children, perhaps in light of that knowledge about crime trends. And the point is made in your statement that the Home Office hadn't been asked to do so by the Cabinet Office, and it hadn't been asked by any other department to contribute to any other department's planning on that issue. That's right, isn't it?
That is all correct.
And as far as you can recall, and again, I recognise that you weren't yet in post, was there any concern within the department by about the 17th of March about that lack of planning?
Well, I think there was a concern that if schools were to close, then we knew what would happen to certain crime types, because there was that pattern that was available from the data in relation to schools closing for a regular summer holiday or whatever.
We're going to come in a moment to look at some notes of meetings where after school closures had been announced, the Home Office was thinking, in light of those trends, what's going to happen and what shall we do? But was there a moment before the announcement was made when officials started to think, hold on, there hasn't been any discussion or planning of this issue and that's going to be a problem?
Just looking at the paperwork for the inquiry, I didn't spot that particular moment, no. And I don't think that in fact, I know that the Home Office did not know about the decision to close schools until just in the run-up to the announcement.
Thank you. I'm asked again if we can both slow down. I'm sorry, that's my fault. I will endeavour to do better. Yes.
You're both falling into the trap that I fall into.
We know then that on the 18th of March, it was announced that schools would be closed to all but vulnerable children and the children of key workers, and that definitions of each of those groups were later published. We understand, again from your statement, that the Home Office was not asked at that stage to contribute to any assessment of the impact of school closures, or indeed, I think, to any advice about who should be on the vulnerable children list. Is that right?
That's correct.
And again, the Home Office wasn't asked to contribute any planning or assessment about the impact on children's safety of lockdown when that was announced on the 23rd of March. Is that right?
That's correct, though I should also say that, as I have previously said, the Home Office had evidence about what happens to certain crime types when schools are closed in general. So we did have that evidence to draw on.
Thank you. And given that the Home Secretary clearly did think and had thought by this stage that there were implications for aspects of the Home Office's work, do you think in hindsight that the fact that the Home Office didn't carry out any sort of planning or impact assessment of that was an omission?
Well, I think the sort of the Home Office specific part of that was fairly well planned for, as I say, because we knew, we worked very closely with policing and others about what happens to certain crime types when schools are closed for a regular holiday, and we were able to have a very quick analysis, assessment of what was likely to happen to those crime types once a school closure decision was taken.
Are you able to help us, and I think this is my last question on this topic, but are you able to help us to understand why there wouldn't have been any of that planning?
Well, only listening to what other witnesses have said. I don't have any evidence from the Home Office from that time as to that can add to what other witnesses have said to you in relation to that question.
I'm sorry, perhaps I wasn't clear. I mean, in terms of the Home Office's own planning.
No, I think I've said what I have to say in my witness statement and earlier this afternoon. I think the Home Office had some concerns because we knew what happens when schools are closed, and we could predict and did predict what would happen when there was a lockdown in relation to different types of crime. Some would go up, some would go down, and so we had I think quite a full and quite a rapid assessment about what was likely to happen, but I accept that was all within the Home Office. It was not part, as far as I could tell from the paperwork, of a wider cross-government exercise in planning.
Can
Thank you.
I just check this again? I'm sorry to interrupt. I think I've got a bit confused from your questions. So Matthew said that he thought there was, for Home Office specific matters, there was fairly well developed planning. But then your question said, why wasn't there planning? So I've got a bit confused what you're putting.
I'm sorry, my lady. Let me see if I can clarify that. I think, Sir Matthew, that you are saying that after lockdown and school closures were announced, at that stage the Home Office was able to apply its knowledge to plan for how to meet the heightened risk. Is that right?
That's right. And that there wasn't a plan, if you like, for lockdown for a pandemic, but there was a plan because it happens 6 times a year every time there's a holiday or a half-term holiday. There's a plan for engaging with policing as crime types vary.
I see. And so for absolute clarity then, prior to the 17th of March, there was no plan within the Home Office to how to respond specifically to the prospect of school closures or lockdown in this pandemic.
That's correct. There were other Home Office plans for Home Office-led equities in relation to pandemic planning, like dealing with a terrorist incident or dealing with issues in the detained estate, as we call it, so immigration detention estate. Those sorts of things, there were well-established plans, but not for the questions that you just raised.
Thank you very much. Can we look then, please, at INQ 000231058? This, I hope, illustrates the point that you've been making, Sir Matthew. This is a readout following a meeting on the 24th of March 2020, and we understand it's a readout of a meeting entitled COVID-19 Resilience and Preparedness with the Security Minister. And if we can look down, please, to pages 4 to 5 of this, we see a section here called CSEA. Before we read that, is it right to understand, I think, from your statement that this was the first occasion on which the implications of the pandemic for protecting children were considered internally, the heightened risk articulated, and some planning taking place about how to respond? Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. We see then some information about this heightened risk. We see note being taken that while limited, China has seen an increase in violence in the home. We see that CEOP, and I think that is the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Unit, is that right?
That's right.
And I think this is by way of response to that heightened risk, are producing material to inform officers on the ground of the heightened risks created by people being at home more. Just pausing on that particular topic, you may know, Sir Matthew, that yesterday we heard from Martin Hewitt, who told us that the police too were worried about the predictable rise in threat to children from violence in the home, and the difficulty that officers faced in knowing how to help in the circumstances of a lockdown. In light of that, can you help us understand, please, when we see it said here that CEOP should produce material for officers of heightened risk, what can we understand that was intended to do? Were officers going to be told just that there was this heightened risk, or was there going to be some information that would help them know what to do in response to that heightened risk?
I don't know any more than what is written here in relation to that particular sentence, but the way that the Home Office and policing work together very, very closely on issues of policy and prioritisation such as this leads me to say that there would have been a lot of work going on, first of all, in the NPCC that Martin Hewitt headed, and indeed in the College of Policing that was responsible for sending guidance to all police forces around the country in response to the concerns that Home Office ministers, the Security Minister in this instance, was expressing to policing partners about the sorts of things that they would need to be ready to be doing more of than they previously were. So
is it your response then that there would have been guidance on top of just stating there is this heightened risk?
Exactly. I think it starts. The sort of the process of providing that guidance would always start with an assessment of the threat of the things which are likely to becoming more important for police to be aware of, and then it would go through the sort of normal coordination procedures, and as I say, the College of Policing would then be responsible for sending guidance around to all the police forces.
Thank you. Moving on in this note, then, we see on transnational CSEA offending, we are likely to see a decrease in the threat. And I think, to be clear, that is about the threat posed by British abusers who abuse children abroad. Is that right?
Yes, or vice versa. So, in other words, it could be. It also means, I think, that foreign people who might want to come to the UK would be much less able to do so because of the travel restrictions.
Understood. Thank you. And then we see more detail about online child sexual exploitation and abuse, and we see the threat assessment that we are likely to see an increase in the same way as we see an increase during the school holiday. We are seeing some communications offender to offender who are discussing a potential increase in offending. They will have seen in media reporting that the regulator on websites might be replaced with AI. CEOP are looking at how we are redeploying resource. Forces are prioritising cases where the offender could commit contact offences. so that we can be clear what the nature of this threat is it principally the abuse of children through their befriending online by adults who persuade them to take or make or share indecent images of themselves? Is that right?
Yes. I mean, very sadly, this is prescient because we did see during the lockdown that there was an increase in pressure on children to create what's called self-generated indecent images. And the final part of this and of that highlighted part was also true, that the tech companies who are normally responsible for taking down such images and other material which facilitates child sexual exploitation and abuse, those tech companies were also dealing with the consequences of restrictions and lockdown, and not all of that work was able to be done either remotely or by bots or AI, as it says here.
And where we see CEOPA looking at how we are redeploying resources, does that mean officers were concentrating on offences that might happen offline as a result of offences committed online?
Yes, I think it does mean that, yes.
Thank you. And as you've said, this reflects your awareness that offences like these usually increase in prevalence at the times when children are not in school, and given school closures, there was a concern that that would now increase.
Exactly.
And when we read that offenders themselves were discussing that increase because regulators might be replaced with AI, this is reflected in some later documents as well, but I think that is because human moderators or humans who respond to this kind of abuse online were less able to do so. And does this indicate the Home Office was worried that automated processes or the use of automated processes was going to be widely known?
Yes, basically. This is referring to media reports, but it is the case that the tech companies, as I just said, were not able to do everything that they previously had done, because the parts that needed to be done by a human in the office, in the workplace, there were constraints on that for those tech companies as well. So they clearly found some ways to continue to do what they had to do, which was to take down illegal content as soon as they were aware of it. But they were doing that either remotely or by using AI and bots.
Thank you. And we see also in this paragraph some reference to the proposed interventions or the proposed response to this heightened threat. We read, there is a focus on clear comms on internet safety for parents, carers and children. All Think You Know ambassadors who are professionals have received messaging to remind them of the reporting portal and guidance on parent info. There has been a significant response to that, 200,000 downloads of Parents' Help Book by Friday morning. We read about a new programme with activities for all key stages of the national curriculum. And we read about contacts with Microsoft and BT in the last fortnight, and Twitter and Facebook to distribute educational packs and guidance. We will come back to that, but I just want to draw your attention to other parts of this page before I ask you questions about it. We read lower down that Simon Bailey was suggesting that from China and Italy there would be an increase in all forms of abuse. He noted that there are early signs that there were more people viewing indecent imagery in the last 2 to 3 days than in the last 2 to 3 months. He discusses the likelihood that multi-agency hubs would come under pressure as the COVID powers coming into effect would require will affect police resource. If we look lower down, still we see the ministerial questions about how we can at Pace corral industry partners to do all that they can. And the Minister asked what engagement we have had with DFE. We see Rebecca Kirby agreeing with the Minister that we need to do more with industry and DFE. And then lower down, the Minister asked if there were any asks from operational partners, and we see a suggestion that there would be real benefits of a cross-government conversation on the challenge of protecting vulnerable children, and the Minister promised to pursue this. Thank you. A number of questions then from this note. Would it be right that what is being discussed here by officials in terms of response to this threat is threefold? First, a policing response to offenders. Second, a possible approach to industry related to how they respond to indecent images online. And third, a communications response designed to ensure that parents and children understand those heightened risks. Is that right?
Yes, those would not be the only three actions that the Home Office would be able to take, but those are the three which come out from that note. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. And if I can ask you about the third of those, so that communication strategy, when we see the reference to activities through all stages of the national curriculum and to professionals, should we understand that this communication strategy was partly intended to come through schools?
That's right, yes. And we will see in later documents, no doubt, that there are, at different stages of the pandemic, different Home Office-led or Home Office-funded initiatives to communicate with different crucial audiences at different times, whether that's parents as here or the children themselves later on.
We have heard quite a lot of evidence in these hearings, Sir Matthew, about the position that schools were in at this time, around the 24th of March. Of course, they had been asked quite suddenly to close and to begin to deliver online learning to children and young people. One head of a large multi-academy trust told us that that was like being asked to build a plane and fly it at the same time. Were there concerns within the Home Office at the time that this policy was being stood up about whether it was realistic that schools would be able to do this at the same time as all of that?
I don't think I found evidence of that particular concern, but I do think that it would have been the case that everyone was realising that we were operating in an entirely new and unfamiliar environment because none of us had experience of a full lockdown previously. And this was a very early attempt, the second day of lockdown, in fact, to work with the Minister for Security to prioritise the big security issues that would be felt during that lockdown. And I think that as I say, it was prescient that all of the issues which arose on this second day of lockdown did turn out to be things which we grappled with as we went through the weeks and months ahead.
And when we see the question from the Minister at the end of the paragraph that's at the top of this page, and this is in relation to that communication strategy, the Minister asked what engagement we have had with DFE. Yeah. Do you know what the answer to that was? Was this strategy specifically of responding to this heightened risk through schools, something that the Home Office had already worked on with the Department for Education?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that specific question, but I do know that there was an ongoing engagement, very intense engagement between officials from the Home Office and the DFE in this period about that sort of issue, and that it was added to by engagement from Home Office ministers, so the Home Secretary and the Security Minister and the Safeguarding Minister, Vicky Atkins.
Thank you. And when we see here in this note that the Minister promised to pursue this cross-government point,
yeah.
Was that James Brokenshire, is that right?
That was James Brokenshire at the time, and I remember him telling us that he had spoken to those different departments. I don't think that he or we set up a sort of a standing body involving those departments. I think it was more a series of individual engagements.
I see. I think we'll come back shortly to that structural point. Just staying for a moment on how the Home Office continue to develop their work on these heightened risks. Can we look now, please, at INQ 000231091? This was the development of the point that Home Office officials were going to talk to industry to see what they were able to do in response. This briefing is dated the 3rd of April, so about 10 days on from the meeting that we have just looked at. We see some discussion, please, at page 3. Thank you. We see again at point 1 that indication of knowledge of the heightened risk. Here, I think we see 3 factors that the Home Office are suggesting are going to contribute to that risk. 1, more children online. 2, more child sex offenders online. And 3, reduced capacity of the moderator. And then expanding on that latter point, at paragraph 2, this is the point that you've made about tech companies' ability to combat the activity being reduced. And if we can look at point 4, expanding on this, given the shortfall of moderators, companies are having to prioritise and changing their use of automated tools. And the point that is made here, I think, is that automated tools can identify indecent imagery, but what they're less good at doing is examining whether, through the course of a set of communications, there is grooming happening, for example. Is that right?
That's right. And also, normally, in normal times, it would be a sort of human action to then definitively decide to take down those particular pages or images, and then to follow up in terms of closing accounts and moving into law enforcement action. Yes.
So this is making the point quite clearly that there's only so much that those automated mechanisms can do when it comes to protecting children.
Exactly. I think this is another example of, in this case, Home Office officials seeking to prioritise and making sure that our maximum effort was pointing in the direction that would have most impact to protect the most vulnerable.
And on that point, Sir Matthew, of course, virtually all children across the UK at this time were at home and moving online for their schooling. Was it the assessment of the Home Office, therefore, that this was a risk facing all children? Or did you consider that it was a risk more for some groups of children than others?
I don't recall seeing an actual assessment of that in preparation for this inquiry, but I think that at the time, the common sense view would have been that although there's a theoretical risk for all children, there's an actual risk for certain groups of children that is greater than for other groups of children. There are some issues that really do relate to all children, but then there are other categories of children who are more vulnerable in one way or another, either more disposed to be on the receiving end of that threat or less able to deal with that threat without support. And so we were particularly focusing on those people, bearing in mind the Home Secretary's and the Home Office's prioritisation to make sure that we are safeguarding the most vulnerable children whenever we possibly can.
Thank you. So if we can look lower down this document, then at page 4, at the proposed interventions to respond to this, we read at paragraph 9 that it was recommended that options 1 to 3 be pursued, keeping 4 to 5 on hold. Option 1, if we can look briefly at that, please, at paragraph 10, was about maintaining pressure on the industry. If we can look, please, at option 2, that's at paragraph 12, thank you. That is the point again about comms and preventative messaging. And if we can look then at option 3, please, this was addressing underage users. It was noted here a significant number of grooming victims are children aged under 13 and below the age limit of the platforms they are groomed on. To reduce this risk, we could ask companies and parents to step up their vigilance on underage accounts. An alternative proposal, accepting that many parents will allow underage children to access, is to promote the use of safety tools which allow parents to control settings or analyse content and send warnings to parents about potentially harmful interactions. Can I ask that explicit acceptance here that parents will allow underage children onto platforms where they might be groomed? Was that an acceptance based on the circumstances of lockdown, so many parents working from home, or is that just a fact of life in this area of work?
I mean, this is something that the Home Office would have been working very closely with our colleagues in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport and others on. And I think I read this as this was a general point of view about what in practice happens in some households.
And accepting that this is a very complex area, given the fairly urgent and high degree of risk that the Home Office had identified, was any thought given to mandating age verification or any strong measures like that at this stage?
I don't have anything to add to what I put in my witness statement on that issue. I mean, that sort of issue does come up a lot, and there would, I mean, something as big a change as that would require, quite significant cross-government working. Wouldn't just be decided by the Home Office.
Thank you. Can we look now at INQ 0006066759? This takes us a little further in time on this same topic to the 10th of April 2020, entitled Briefing from TEAU. What is that, please? I'm sorry, it's not entitled in that way. We see it in the top right-hand corner from TEAU. Is that a unit?
Yeah, the U will stand for unit.
Perhaps it's not significant.
Apologies.
Too many acronyms. What do you think?
Many acronyms, yes. We see under the heading key judgments for the week commencing the 6th of April are a number of factors continue to increase children's exposure to online sexual abuse. So seemingly emerging evidence here that the concern about children spending more time online is manifesting. And we see here the comment that the number of vulnerable children who are attending school has dropped to 28,000 on the 31st of March from 70,000 on the 16th of March. So it appears from this that the Home Office is quite closely monitoring the attendance at school of vulnerable children and drawing a link between attendance numbers and children spending time online. Why is that, and why the particular focus on vulnerable children?
So, of course, the Department for Education are and were the policy lead for schools, including schooling for vulnerable children. The Home Office angle was about vulnerability and ensuring that we did everything we could to safeguard the most vulnerable. And I think we were, in the Home Office, disappointed how few vulnerable people were going to school. I think it was 15% at one point. And we knew that was a further risk factor. I mean, all of the arrows were going in the wrong direction. So the number of children online was going up. The number of children able to report concerns or abuse was going down. The number of perpetrators who had the ability to perpetrate acts in some aspects was going up, in other aspects it was going down. The tech companies' ability, as we've just discussed, to take down material rapidly was also reducing. And absolutely crucially, the ability of the support services, the charities, the NGOs, teachers and others to sort of see into the lives of vulnerable children was also reducing as a result of lockdown and school closure.
Can I ask, and this may be an obvious question, the Department for Education's guidance about who was a vulnerable child for the purpose of attendance at school included factors such as whether a child has a social worker or an EHCP plan.
I think that was it, wasn't it? That was the.
There was a slight discretion, as my lady has heard at some length. In addition to that, was that group of children the same group of children that the Home Office would have identified as vulnerable for the purposes of child sexual abuse and exploitation online, or is that a different set of considerations?
I mean, sadly, it's a wider group than that that would have been of concern to the Home Office. But that first group would have been, broadly speaking, a subset of the wider group. So I think ensuring that as many as possible from that smallish group were able to get the protection that would have come from being at school was an important priority for the Home Office. But it wasn't the only thing that we were worried about. We were also worrying about that wider group of children who didn't count as vulnerable in that relatively narrow sense, but who were absolutely open to vulnerability from child sexual exploitation and other types of abuse.
Thank you. And we see there, just for completeness, at the subsequent two paragraphs, the point that you have been making about the concern about underreporting in circumstances where schools are closed. Yes. If we can look, please, then, at paragraph 6 of this same document over on page 3. This again gives us some information about how the Home Office was intending to respond to that. And we read, we are continuing to use cross-government forums to drive forward action across the vulnerable children agenda. This has included utilising the General Public Sector Ministerial Implementation Group discussion on school provision to recognise the vital role that schools play. And lower down, additionally, we will use next week's GPSMIG discussion to highlight the work the department is doing on hidden crimes, including sexual abuse, and to push other government departments on further action, for example, DFE on incentivising children, DCMS on optimising opportunities from IT connectivity, and the role of youth workers. And I should also have emphasised the sentence just before that that shows us work being undertaken through violence reduction units to ensure children are kept safe and off the streets. And whereas we've been talking until now largely about child sexual abuse and exploitation online, is it right that here the concern that's being discussed is about safety, criminality, perhaps county lines? Is that right?
Absolutely, yes. All of those things would count as crimes that we were worried might increase during lockdown. Yes.
Thank you. The date of this document, as we saw, is the 10th of April, and the inquiry has heard evidence, Sir Matthew, from Miss Indra Morris, who had been a Director General in the Department for Education, and who by this stage was the senior responsible officer for a cross-government work stream called the Vulnerable Children's Unit. Part of the remit of that unit was to look at safeguarding issues and hidden harms. In this document, which appears to be specifically discussing cross-government work and opportunities to bring up that cross-government work on these subjects, we don't see any reference to the Vulnerable Children's Unit. Should we take it from that the Home Office wasn't working through that unit yet with the Department for Education?
No, I wouldn't read that into it. I think that would have been the part of the Department for Education that my colleagues in the relevant parts of the Home Office were engaging with. TEAU, by the way, I think probably stands for Tackling Exploitation and Abuse Unit, and they would have been an example of a part of the Home Office that would have been working with Indra Morris's part of the Department for Education.
I see.
So I think when we probably didn't use that acronym, beginning with V for her unit, we just talked about it as the DFE.
I see, thank you. So if there was a cross-government working group coming out of the DFE on these issues, you would have thought about that as part of the DFE, is that right?
Exactly.
Understood.
Yes.
Can we look then, please, at INQ 000518579? This was a memo to number 10, slightly later in the period, the 24th of April, and it's about opportunities to increase interventions on the hidden crimes agenda. We can see from paragraph 3 what is meant by hidden crimes, those which relate to emotional or physical harm or abuse both in and outside of the home. And if we can look, please, at paragraph 10 of this document, which is at page 2, thank you. We read that number 10 was being informed that stakeholders such as the Victims Commissioner, Domestic Abuse Commissioner and national charities have been pressing for greater action from government on these issues and have been critical of a perceived fragmented government approach. Are you able to help us with that, Sir Matthew? What was the perception about a fragmented government approach?
I think from the perspective of those commissioners and coalitions and others, they would have, I imagine, wanted to hear from government with one voice and have more of a sense than there was that there was a prioritisation within government about the issues that mattered most to government at this difficult time. And indeed, we had our own concerns within the Home Office about that sort of issue. So it wasn't just these, if you like, semi-external voices who were expressing concerns about fragmentation. We were having our own concerns and trying to address them. I don't know if you're going to come on to that, but there are examples of times when I or others in the Home Office raised our concerns with the Cabinet Office to try to improve the joined-up nature of government decision-making during the pandemic?
Yes, we will, is the answer to that. We will come to look at that email. Can we take it then that you had some sympathy at this stage with the criticism of a fragmented government approach to these issues?
Yes, and we're keen to channel that into something positive, which broadly became this Hidden Harm Summit that the then Prime Minister hosted.
Yes, thank you. We will look at that. If we can just stay for a moment with this document. Can we look, please, over at page 5, paragraphs 20 and 22? Because I think in this document, actually, you're doing exactly that. You're highlighting further areas where you could encourage joint working to improve victim support. And we see, for example, reviewing the approach to high-risk perpetrators of domestic abuse, considering whether within existing arrangements there are opportunities for selected agencies to proactively contact at-risk households in a safe way. And obviously for children, the removal potentially of domestic violence perpetrators would reduce the risk to them. Now that might be thought a potentially obvious role for children's social care, and potentially the police. Do you know if that happened?
I don't know about whether it specifically happened as a follow-up to that particular point, but it is something that the Home Office would have been working with policing on constantly, including with other agencies, as it mentions here.
I mean, if we can sort of take the points together, on the one hand, concern about fragmentation, which the Home Office had some sympathy with, and then on the other, this specific example of something that could be done better. Do you think there were obstacles until this stage to that sort of approach happening?
No, I think the obstacles that I was talking about in my previous answer related to the sort of the big picture prioritisation of where the government should be putting its effort at a time of unprecedented national lockdown. What this paragraph is talking about is, I would say, areas where more run-of-the-mill, day-to-day effective joint working can make a difference in protecting the most vulnerable. This doesn't require a summit from the Prime Minister to improve. This is just about, as I say, day-to-day joint working at a relatively working level between different departments or different parts of the sector to prioritise limited resource to target it at the people who will get most benefit from that resource.
Well, it's exactly that point I want to ask you about then. So, for example, the third bullet point here, exploring opportunities to enhance OP and Compass, especially around children who are identified in domestic abuse households, as well as not currently attending school under vulnerability criteria at present. That is perhaps a small picture example, as you say, of something that could be achieved with joined-up working. Had that not been happening to date because of a lack of joined-up working?
I mean, I think something like this, where the crucial partners will all be local. So we're talking about local authority working with local health and law enforcement and other officials. The constraints on that joint working will have been that everyone was still getting used to dealing with an unprecedented lockdown. And so I think that there would have been many opportunities available to improve that joint working, which, as I say, almost always are at a local level.
Thank you. I want to take up then that structural point that you raised earlier. If we can look, please, at INQ 000239640. This, I think, is the email that you were talking about a moment ago. Thank you. This is the beginning then with the email sent to you on the 13th of May from Miss Helen McNamara, asking you if you could please provide your view on organisational and governance structures used in government, what you have found useful so far, and your thoughts on what you would value next. And if we can look up at page 1, we see your response a few days later, and you make 3 points. First, we should try a less traditional hub and spoke arrangement, suggesting the centre could remit issues to small groups of officials from across departments to own and lead on behalf of all. Second, you say the Home Secretary has already expressed concern that the current governance structure can lead to siloed discussions. And third, you make a point about tweaking reporting requirements to the centre. So, Matthew, you're not here being specific about any aspect of the Home Office's work when you make these points, but I want to ask you whether some of them relate to the Home Office's work to protect children. And before we do that, I just want to ask you about one other document so that you can see the point in the round, and that is, please, INQ 000181673. And that is the report from the Prime Minister's Hidden Harm Summit that you were referring to. This is the 26th of June. And if we can look, please, at page 9, we see coming out of that summit a recommendation, second bullet point, efforts to coordinate work across departments on domestic abuse and sexual violence have served to highlight the challenges of overcoming entrenched siloed working and structures. We need to ensure effective, regular coordination as standard in the future. So just taking a step back then, there seems to be a bit of a pattern of this concern having first been raised, we saw on the 16th of March, then the concern about fragmentation on the 24th of April, your email raising that point to Ms McNamara, in mid-May and the point coming out again in late June. Was this quite a severe concern then about siloed working affecting the way that government was able to respond to domestic abuse, for example?
I mean, to be honest, I don't think I did have domestic abuse specifically in mind when I wrote the email to Helen McNamara. Not specifically. I was thinking about the central government's COVID coordination mechanisms in general. And many of the domestic abuse challenges which we are discussing in these documents were exacerbated by COVID, but they were there all along. And they were to do with the fact that so many different parts of central government and local partners are involved in any case as complex as this. And so I think what I was seeking to get the Cabinet Office to improve was the more top-level sort of policy responses to be better streamlined. They didn't seem streamlined to me at all. There was a huge burden on the Department for Health and the Cabinet Office at the centre, including Number 10. But there were other departments who were available, who could have sort of lent in and been encouraged to take on more of a leadership role to spread that burden and to make the overall effectiveness of the government's response that bit better.
Thank you. So just thinking specifically then about the Home Office's work for children and to protect children, is it your position that that wasn't suffering from siloed working? It was more of a top-down, high-level strategy issue?
Yes. I mean, I think in relation to children, I mean, there are always tensions, if you like. There are always going to be an interface between the Department for Education and, let's say, the Home Office on issues that are to do with children and therefore of concern to the Department for Education, but are also to do with crime or migration or policing or national security, and therefore also of interest to the Home Office. That's something that's sort of built into the system. And in my view, it doesn't matter so much where the line is drawn between those two different departments. What matters is how one works across that line between those two departments. So to pick up a line of questioning about whether there, for instance, there should have been a single minister for children. I mean, in my view, there is a minister for children, and it's the ministers in the Department for Education. That doesn't take responsibilities for children away from the Home Office, and nor should it. And if it did, it would just redraw the line, if you like, between Department for Education and the Home Office. There will always be a line between those departments. And what I'm trying to get at, particularly in those three short points to the Cabinet Office, is about working across that line and the equivalence of that line between all other government departments. That's the bit that I felt was not optimally set up during the first months of the COVID response.
That question of whether there ought to be a Minister for Children or alternatively the extent to which the Secretary of State for Education carries out that function was something that Ms. Susan Ackland-Hood addressed in her evidence earlier in these proceedings. She emphasised that the Secretary of State for Education has a named role as the government's lead minister for children, and that if the individual minister in that position so wishes, they can call on that cross-cutting role to influence policy in other departments or activity in other departments. But that, for various reasons, during the pandemic, that didn't happen. Was that also your experience, that you didn't see that happening on the part of Sir Gavin Williamson during the pandemic?
Yes.
Do you think it ought to have happened?
I think it ought to have happened somehow, but there are lots of different ways that it could have been made to work. And I was encouraging the Cabinet Office not to think of everything as about the Cabinet Office's relationship with just one other department. That's a sort of very old-fashioned hub-and-spoke view of how to run a government. And I was encouraging them, not just in that email, but in many other conversations at the time and since, to have a much more modern, agile, federated setup that would allow more resource to be instantly available for the biggest priorities.
thinking specifically about the concern about protecting children from this range of hidden harms that were discussed at the summit, and given that pattern that we spoke about and that we've seen through your evidence of concern about fragmentation or siloed working, did anything change after that recommendation on the 26th of June?
I think there was a greater prioritisation across government on tackling hidden harms, and that was really why the Home Office had recommended so forcefully to Number 10 in that note that we were looking at a few minutes ago, having that moment that brought together all of the players, not just in central government, but thinking about policing, support services, many others as well, making that a high priority part of the government's response. I think that did lead to greater prioritisation, which fed into how local authorities, local police forces, public health officials and many others involved tackled the issue. So yes, I think it did make a positive difference at a difficult time.
Thank you. Can we then return to our chronology, please, and pick it up in October of 2020 and look at your statement at paragraphs 327, thank you, to 328. You tell us that at this stage, a Home Office vulnerability knowledge and practice programme had summarised voluntary sector feedback on the impact of the first national lockdown on children and young people. And we can see, if we're able to have an overall view on this list, thank you, that it is very lengthy and discusses some grave impacts on children and young people. So an increase in all forms of abuse, increase in gang-related violence, including through the county lines model, increase in the need for emergency accommodation. We won't go through them all, but they are, as I said, grave. Noting that that's a summary of voluntary sector feedback, would it be right to say that that accorded with the Home Office's own understanding on the pandemic, on the impact of the pandemic on children and young people at this stage? Yes,
I think it represents a very helpful summary of that feedback. And I also think that it's an example of monitoring and evaluating, something that the government does not always get a lot of credit for doing properly. But I think this is an example of some instant monitoring and evaluating of how the first lockdown played out, and given the timing, we were then able to use that to plan for subsequent lockdowns and different stages of the pandemic.
Thank you.
And by we, I don't just mean the Home Office, sorry. I also mean particularly policing and other law enforcement and other operational partners.
Thank you. And given that assessment, and given that that was the Home Office's view, would it be fair to say that the Home Office in the winter of 2020 was concerned about the likely impact of future lockdowns and further school closures?
Yes.
Can we look then, please, at how the Home Office planned to address that possibility at INQ 000231228? This is described as, I think, as a readout from a briefing of Ministers Atkins and Malthouse at a deep dive the previous day. It's dated the 6th of November. And it looks as though on this occasion Home Office officials were updating the ministers in some detail about both risks and the plan to respond to those risks over winter. If we can look, please, over at page 2, under point 4, on county lines, we see what we did during the first lockdown. Drugs are a key driver of SV. Is that serious violence?
I think it might be sexual violence.
Sexual violence. Drug supply through the border interrupted by the first lockdown, but county lines continued to operate. Can we go further down, please, to read the rest of that? Thank you. We see April to June, drug offences up 30%. Was there thought to be a connection there between school closures and an increase in drug offences?
Yes, there was. And clearly there were factors in both directions. There were some factors of lockdown that made it harder for drug supply to continue for the benefit of criminals. But there were other aspects of lockdown that frankly made it easier. And so this, I think, is important evidence that taking all that together, there was an increase in the use of county lines in particular as a way of transporting drugs around the country.
Thank you. And we see lower down under serious violence a similar description of what happened during the first lockdown, and then we see there approach to the second lockdown, asks of DFE, we need a real focus on attendance, particularly in alternative provision. And then a specific point about the sector having raised an issue in finding appropriate space for face-to-face meetings with young people, and a point for Minister Atkins about whether it would be possible for the DFE to ensure that schools could be used in that respect. 2 points then here. Was it the Home Office's analysis that having young people attending alternative provision in particular would help to bring down rates of serious violence?
Yes.
And second, had there been any difficulty in engaging the Department for Education in this?
No, I don't think so. I just think this was the ministers, particularly Vicky Atkins, as it says here, using this meeting to get ready for her next wave of issues to engage that department on. Thank you.
And if we can look at the next document then on this being taken forward is INQ 000518729. And I think this is possibly, Sir Matthew, the final document we will look at before we take a break. This is a letter to the Home Secretary the following day, updating her on Hidden Harm's winter preparedness. And if we can look, please, over at page 2, there is a summary of that deep dive that we've just been looking at. And we see a bullet point in respect of schools. At the risk of repeating a frustration you know well, we need the DFE to explain how they are prioritising school attendance, particularly in pupil referral units, to ensure we are tackling hidden harms. Modern slavery officials have data which shows that referrals to the NRM from county lines victims significantly dropped when schools reopened this year. NRM, I think that's National Referral Mechanism, is it?
That's right. That's the mechanism whereby someone who might be of a concern in relation to modern slavery is referred into that system.
I see. And so do we understand the connection there is that when schools were open, fewer children were engaging in county lines and therefore being referred through that mechanism?
Exactly, and therefore our concern being that if and when there were a further school closure to come, that welcome reduction would be reversed and there'd be a worrying increase again in referrals.
And that line, at the risk of repeating a frustration you know well, can you help us with that, please? How do we understand that?
I mean, I think that's an indication that that Vicky Atkins and Priti Patel, the then Home Secretary, were talking regularly to each other as well as to officials about what we all from the Home Office wanted to be doing in relation to Department for Education, which is to get the school attendance up, including when schools are closed, but open for vulnerable children, making sure that in particular that number could go up as far as possible, bearing in mind the very strong Home Office view that it is schools that are able to provide the best protection for all children, including vulnerable children.
We have heard, Sir Matthew, quite extensive evidence on what the DFE were doing to try to address attendance. Does this comment suggest that the Home Office did not understand what the DFE were doing to try to address attendance?
Well, I think you can sense the frustration that, despite multiple conversations, there were still concerns that we wanted to continue to impress upon the Department for Education, and we did.
Thank you. And just taking a step back then from the documents, Indra Morris, when she gave evidence, and indeed in her written evidence, identified teenagers as one group of children and young people who were particularly hard to reach and support during the pandemic. Of course, it is teenagers who are very often involved in county lines. Do you at the Home Office share that view that it was difficult to reach and support teenagers during the pandemic?
Yes.
And we have seen, I think, throughout your evidence that some of the work that could have been done to support teenagers would have been between the Department for Education, but also we saw the Department for Culture, Media and Sports have youth policy, and HMCLG, I will call them, who have ownership of community and family work. Was there a structural difficulty in coordinating the work intended to support teenagers?
I mean, I do think this is an area where, in general, again, unrelated to the pandemic, but the concerns became heightened by the pandemic, but the concerns were there all along, the creation and sustaining and delivering of youth policy is fragmented across central government.
Thank you, Sir Matthew. My lady, I'm about to move on to a new topic, and I think it's about 5
Certainly,
minutes.
we take breaks every so often, Sir Matthew, but I promise you we will finish your evidence today. I shall return at 20 past.
All rise.
Let's go.
Thank you. So, Matthew, I want to ask you now, please, to consider some evidence from towards the end of the pandemic period about the impact of the pandemic on various aspects of the Home Office's work that we've been discussing. And as we go through, I will ask you to help us understand how, in light of that, the Home Office would evaluate the effectiveness of its response on various types of risks facing children. Can we look then, please, at INQ 000268039? This is a statistics briefing from the NSPCC in February 2022. And can we look at pages 8 to 9, please? Thank you. Here we have some evidence about the data that suggests a potential increase in the number of children exposed to domestic abuse during the pandemic. We won't go through it in a great amount of detail because I think we have the evidential point. But it is indicating, for example, a 61% increase in the number of contacts to and from the National Domestic Abuse Helpline compared with similar levels for the first 3 months of 2020. And I think, Sir Matthew, you've had the opportunity to consider this document, is that right?
That is right, yes.
Would you agree that it is reasonable to conclude that the pandemic and specifically lockdown and school closures did have the effect of increasing the rates at which children were exposed to domestic violence within the home?
Yes, I think sadly we can conclude that. I don't think we know within that increase how much is specifically down to COVID and the measures to tackle COVID, but I think we can make an estimate. And clearly, it's very sad, and it's worse than that for the victims who were involved.
And I think you've already said that this is something the Home Office was concerned about at the very outset. So it wasn't just predictable; it was predicted.
It was predictable and predicted, but it gives me no comfort to say that.
Yes.
I do think that looking back, the Home Office and our operational partners were able to reprioritise quickly because of those early assessments, and I pay tribute to those operational partners who did that. But clearly, these documents here demonstrate that collectively we've failed to reduce the negative impact of lockdown. A lot of work went on to keep those increases as low as possible. It could have been worse, but we are obviously saddened by the facts that are on that document.
And we have seen in your evidence that the Home Office at the very beginning took steps to ensure that police officers were alert to risks. We've seen that through other government departments, the Home Office took steps to ensure that there was provision in place for abusers to leave the home throughout. We also know that during the course of the pandemic, the Home Office sponsored the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, which had the effect of recognising children as victims of domestic abuse in their own right. Can you help us, please, with what the rationale was for that and what the impact was of that, if you're able to say?
So this was an important priority for the government at the time to demonstrate that it was doing everything possible to put domestic abuse at the sort of centre of considerations, and to do even more than previously to support those who might become victims of it. And having that offence being created so that there were additional tools for law enforcement to use to pursue people who might be perpetrators of domestic abuse. And it was an important part of the legislation. When you look at the totality of what a government can do, there is legislation, there is communication, there is funding, there is prioritisation. Most of those levers are relatively indirect on something like this. But what we are relying on is the whole of the system that we are operating within to prioritise in ways that protect the most vulnerable. And I do think, despite the evidence here, which suggests that things did get worse, they didn't perhaps get as worse as they could have done if we had not taken those steps.
And given that overview, and given the impact that we can see there nonetheless was, with the benefit of hindsight, is there anything that the Home Office assesses could have been done better during the pandemic to address this particular risk?
Well, I think that even in the second lockdown, we learnt from the first lockdown. So, for instance, just to take a bureaucratic example, the way that the regulations and guidance to police on how to enforce the regulations were written, that was something that improved as the pandemic went on. We got sort of more precise about what the enforcement aspects of the public order consequences of the lockdown, for instance, would be. That's an example of something where we learned during the pandemic. In terms of protecting children and the most vulnerable, I think the system operated within the constraints as well as it could, bearing in mind that any full-scale closure of schools was going to be a very significant challenge in terms of protection of the most vulnerable. I think that the learning that went on at the very beginning and then throughout the pandemic did mean that the outcome was less bad than it otherwise would have been.
So, Sir Matthew, if you were speaking to a person who was in your shoes in the future, as Permanent Secretary to the Home Office at the outset of what looked like a civil emergency where there was a possibility that people would have to stay in their homes, knowing that that would present a heightened risk as it did, is there anything from your learning that we could extrapolate for that future situation?
I think first of all, act early. So make sure that the crucial support services are funded to carry on their work. Because one of the things that did happen, I think, during the first lockdown was that the charities and other support services, some of them did run out of funding. I think the government did respond quickly to address that, including in relation to tackling and preventing domestic abuse. But I would encourage very early action on that score. Secondly, technology. I mean, any future pandemic or any future lockdown is likely to have a transformed landscape in terms of technology. Back in 2020, there was still a very significant technology aspect to the pandemic, both the response to it and the actions that happen, including, sadly, perpetrators of child abuse and so on. That is going to be even greater in any future lockdown or any future pandemic. So really understanding and having the sort of relations with the tech companies and the regulators that allow that sort of action is going to be even more important in the future.
Can I just go back to the point you were discussing a moment ago, Sir Matthew, about the regulations and the guidance? I'm a former criminal lawyer, and I was horrified when I saw the contents of some of the early legislation, and I pitied the members of the public to try and work out whether they were breaking the law or not, and I pitied the poor police officers who had to enforce it. And I think I was told, was I not, that legislation at the beginning was drafted by the Department of Health and without the experts, namely the Home Office, whose usual remit criminal justice is, input.
That is correct, my lady. The very first set of regulations were drafted without Home Office or policing input. But I choose to look at the positive of that, which is that things got better as we went through the pandemic, and we did learn from the awfulness of that exercise to make a slightly better fist of it as we went through the pandemic. And I think you heard yesterday from Martin Hewitt, that he felt that he was able, as time went on, to put across directly into the Home Office, and then for us in the Home Office to put across into the wider government decision-making and drafting of regulations and guidance, a better and better picture as it related to the day-to-day policing. Now, of course, as you know better than anyone, the police are operationally independent, but they do require guidance and sometimes direction and prioritisation. And in the case of the pandemic, I think the Home Secretary and the Home Office were very clear that we had this, or that we wanted the police to have this 4 E's approach, that they should educate, they should explain, they should engage. And only after having done all 3 of those E's should they get onto the 4th E of enforce. That meant that clearly there were some outliers. There were some forces that jumped straight to enforcement in ways which weren't particularly proportionate and therefore not appropriate. But I think the mechanisms that police have themselves and with the Home Office, they managed to iron those out as time went on. That doesn't excuse everything, but I think it does mean that as time went on, we and they, policing, got a bit better at doing this enforcement.
Understanding all of that, but really going back to, was asking you about what lessons we've learned. And surely the basic principle of criminal justice, as you know, is if you don't have a criminal offence with a penal sanction unless the law is clear. It's clear for the person who's committing the offence and it's clear for the person who's trying to enforce it. Would not a lesson to be learned that if you are going to pass regulations that have a penal sanction, that you should ensure that people like the Home Office, who are the experts in drafting criminal justice bills, should be involved?
Yes, I would absolutely agree with that.
Thank you. Sorry, it's one of my hobby horses.
Thank you. So, Matthew, we were discussing the question of what overall impact had been, what could have been done better, and what lessons we can learn from that in the context of domestic abuse within the home. But the answers that you gave, I think, to the latter questions were more general. Yeah. So I want to ask you just briefly and narrowly a couple of questions about other types of harms. I don't think I need to take you back to the NSPCC data because I understand that you're familiar with it. Can I ask whether it's your position that it is reasonable to conclude also that the pandemic, lockdown and school closures did have the effect of increasing the rates at which children were exposed to online sexual abuse and exploitation?
Yes. I think the evidence is clear on that for a number of different factors, and I think we've talked about most of them already. But children were online more. Yes. Some of them were bored and very easily persuaded to, for instance, to self-generate indecent images. There was much harder. It was much harder for support services to have any visibility, under-reporting, the tech companies, all those other factors that we talked about.
And as I say, you gave a general answer, a broad answer earlier to the question of what we can learn. But is there anything specific about the Home Office's attempts to meet that risk that we can learn for a future pandemic, noting what you say about technology likely being different?
I mean, I do think technology is already, sadly, making this terrain even harder to tackle. And you know, I think the current government has already made it an offence to create deepfake pornography, for instance. But that sort of thing is just getting easier and easier, sadly, from a technological point of view to happen, and therefore is likely to be even more widespread, and is likely in any future lockdown to be an even greater driver in different types of exploitation and abuse.
So do we take it then that part of your answer is that there is too much uncertainty about what that risk might look like in the future to be able to draw clear lessons?
And I think I wasn't making that point. I mean, I think it is unclear how far technology will have gone, not least because we don't know when the next lockdown might be. But I think we absolutely know that whenever it is, if there were ever to be another one again, that the technological landscape would have advanced very dramatically, and that the role of the tech companies will be even bigger in the future than it is now or was in 2020.
Thank you. I think, Sir Matthew, that the position in respect of a different type of harm that we've been discussing, so children's exposure to criminality and involvement in criminality, is perhaps a bit more nuanced. And you say in your statement, I don't think I need to take you there, that the heightened risks of children's exposure to violence and exploitation by gangs and organised crime groups and involvement in associated criminal activities have been reported, but the full extent of the impacts of violence and criminal exploitation for children throughout the COVID-19 crisis are difficult to ascertain. And those were findings reported to the Home Office in 2021 by the Manchester Metropolitan University. Is it then the Home Office's view that this is more difficult to ascertain, or has the Home Office been able to draw conclusions about the impact of school closure and lockdown on the rates at which children and young people were exposed to criminal exploitation?
I'm not aware of any sort of definitive judgments in that made by the Home Office since that time, but drawing on that and other research, I think we can conclude that it's a sort of common sense view that during lockdown some crime types actually reduced. You know, things obviously shoplifting reduced because the shops weren't open. Most of the public order worries that we had at the beginning of the pandemic didn't come to pass, thankfully. But then other things, including most of the crimes that we've been talking about today, online and in the real world, child sexual abuse, for instance, did increase. On things like county lines, gangs, and so on, I think, as you say, there is mixed evidence. But on the whole, the trends are towards greater concern in terms of protection of vulnerable children.
Thank you. So, Matthew, I want to move now to a completely different subject. We have only two subjects left, and this is one of them, and it is the ways in which the pandemic affected unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. And so, Matthew, there is, of course, something of a complicated background to some of these issues, but I think we can take it fairly shortly because the factual situation was recorded by Mr. Justice Chamberlain in a series of High Court judgments, and I'm going to draw from those. We know, don't we, that for many years prior to the pandemic, there had been difficulty in Kent County Council because that council had struggled to be able to accommodate the numbers of children arriving in Kent, and that they had relied on the National Transfer Scheme, by which, in principle, other local authorities volunteered to receive children who would otherwise be coming into Kent care. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you. And we know that for some years that scheme had not been operating well, in the sense that other local authorities were not routinely offering to receive children in the way that had been intended. Is that right?
Yes.
And that meant that Kent continued to look after more unaccompanied asylum-seeking children pursuant to their responsibilities under the Children Act of 1989 than other local authorities did. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you. Against that background, then, I want to ask you about how the circumstances of the pandemic specifically affected some of these arrangements. Would the Home Office agree that the closure of ports of entry to the UK meant that there was even a higher number than usual of children arriving on Kent's coast? So we heard from Kent County Council, for example, that the local authority was caring for 402 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children at the start of 2020, but that this had risen to 605 by August.
That's correct. I think it's important to say at this point that the Home Office's judgment about the total number of people coming into the country irregularly or unlawfully did not dramatically change in the early years of the pandemic, but the route by which they came did change. So previously, before the small boats phenomenon, most people who wanted to come into this country irregularly or illegally did so through the Channel Tunnel or on a ferry, largely in the back of lorries. And they were distributed, if you like, around the country. Of course, most of them arrived in Kent, but then carried on hidden until other parts of the country. Whereas with small boats, almost every single small boat arrival, first of all, isn't trying to hide, trying to be very visibly part of the asylum-seeking system. And secondly, they almost all arrive in Kent. So yes, this phenomenon, partly driven by COVID and the travel restrictions, did put an additional burden on Kent, even beyond that which, as you say rightly, they were already suffering from as a county before the pandemic.
Thank you. And is it right also that some support services at the same time, and because of the restrictions introduced during the pandemic, suspended their operations, so particularly the Refugee Council, who had been running an intake service for these children in Kent. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. They were running the main, in fact, the intake
Yes.
service for children in Kent, funded by the Home Office, and there had been a very good relationship, I think, between my colleagues in the Home Office and the Refugee Council in the Kent intake unit. And the Refugee Council sadly had to end that service because of staff absences.
And would the Home Office also agree that the guidance on lockdown and self-isolation, which again was health guidance, not Home Office guidance, meant that many local authorities other than Kent were even less willing than before to receive unaccompanied asylum-seeking children? And again, we heard from Kent that between January 2020 and May 2020, Kent weren't able to transfer a single child to another local authority. Is that right?
That's right. And at that time, the National Transfer Scheme was a voluntary scheme between local authorities. So that is right, yes.
And we know that by August of 2020, Kent County Council took the formal position that as a result of these pressures, it was no longer able to meet its statutory obligations to care for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, which was later found to be unlawful. But it's right also, isn't it, that Mr. Justice Chamberlain went on to find that the Home Office shared some responsibility for that position because of the way that the National Transfer Scheme had been run?
That is right. I mean, I think what he found is that the duty was on the county, and that was not a duty which could have been, balanced off against other duties. It was a primary
Yes.
duty, and he found that Kent should have abided by it.
Yes. And Sir Matthew, we have seen evidence during these hearings that for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, the net effect of all of those cumulative changes, I suppose, because of the pandemic, was that they were staying for longer than usual at the intake unit on immediate arrival. And then once processed, they were in many cases staying in unregulated accommodation, such as hotels. And that in that sense, they were not there as children who were looked after by the local authority, but they were simply housed there by the Home Office, and therefore they weren't receiving the care or education from the local authority as a corporate parent.
It's right that Kent refused to, or said they were unable to meet their duty to provide that care and set of services for those children. And it's also right that in that circumstance, the Home Office decided reluctantly, but better than any alternative, to house some of those children in hotels. That is right, yes.
I should say, Sir Matthew, that of course it's not the function of this inquiry to examine the intricacies of the immigration system or even the arrangements of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children generally, but the question of whether the pandemic made matters worse for those children and whether that could have been avoided or mitigated is a matter for this inquiry. Can I ask you then to reflect on some particular aspects? What Kent County Council told us, or rather the Director of Children's Services for Kent County Council told us, is that if the national referral mechanism had been made mandatory at that time, some of the pandemic-related pressures might have been mitigated. What do you say to that?
I agree. I'm sure it is true that if it had been mandatory, then other local authorities would have had to step up and take on that burden from Kent.
And some children's rights organisations might say that the public health advice, which required self-isolation for incoming children, even if asymptomatic, could or should have been subject to some exemptions for this vulnerable cohort. Accepting that absolutely wasn't your guidance, do you have a view on that?
Well, I know that my colleagues in the Home Office spent considerable time and effort engaging with Public Health England on that guidance and the interpretation of that guidance, and it was disappointing. I remember that there wasn't any leeway to create additional guidance or additional exemptions, as you're suggesting. So the public health position was very black and white. These particular children, like everyone else in the country, has to abide by this guidance. And that was one of the things that made it impossible for both the Refugee Council and then for Kent County Council to fulfil the services that they were previously providing.
Thank you. Another point that may be raised by children's rights organisations is that some of the lockdown-specific pressures that unaccompanied asylum-seeking children faced whilst in hotels, such as the difficulty of having to try to sort out an education with limited or no Wi-Fi, could have been alleviated by extra support from the Home Office. What would you say to that?
I mean, I think the Home Office provided significant extra support, both to the relevant counties and then directly in the hotels. And I'm sure that it was not perfect, that support, but there was a huge amount of effort from my colleagues operating in very difficult circumstances. Remember, picking up a burden which really shouldn't have been theirs in the first place, but deciding that it was better to do that, albeit imperfectly, themselves, than for these children to be left really to their own devices.
Thank you, Sir Matthew. I want to move on then to the final topic, which is a somewhat miscellaneous but important topic of children's play. My lady asked you earlier questions about precision, or perhaps the lack of precision in guidance about regulations that police officers were required to enforce. And the inquiry has heard evidence throughout these hearings about occasions when children were stopped by police for playing and directed to return home in the course of police enforcing the stay-at-home message. And examples that we heard were police telling children to stop climbing trees or playing in a river or building a snowman. And those examples come from throughout the pandemic. So that snowman example is from January 2021. The inquiry also heard from Martin Hewitt about how difficult that was for police officers. And what he said was that he was communicating that difficulty to the Home Office. And to paraphrase his evidence, I think he said that the Home Office were very receptive to that concern and were engaging with him. But he wasn't sure how well that was reaching Cabinet Office, for instance, or again, to paraphrase, Department for Health, where the guidance was emanating from. Are you able to help with that? Is that something the Home Office were worried about? And do you think that concern was heard outside of the Home Office?
So first of all, Martin Hewitt and policing in general did an extraordinary job in very difficult circumstances, including on this particular issue. And so their message was heard loud and clear in the Home Office about the difficulties of the approach to enforcement of the various different regulations, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic. But I accept that it also carried on to some extent later on. And I would agree with him that even on issues where the Home Office was fully aligned with policing, that did not automatically translate into whoever was drafting the regulations or the guidance, picking up every part of that nuance and doing exactly what we wanted. Absolutely not. And as I said to my lady earlier, I confirmed that the Home Office was not involved in the original drafting of the regulations. I do think it is worth underlining two other points, though. First of all, the police are operationally independent, and so the decisions about how to go about implementing all law and all regulations do fall to each chief in each of the 43 police forces up and down the country. And secondly, there was a very clear position during COVID about the 4 E's, and you only get to the fourth E, enforcement, after you as an individual police officer have done the engage, the educate, and the
explain and enforce. And I wrote them down.
And explain. And of course, it's all in the. I imagine it's all in the tone of voice. It would be possible for a police officer to think that they were explaining and engaging, but it might have come across, particularly to a child, as enforcement in a way that would have absolutely left a mark on them. So I think this is an area where. Clearly there are lessons that we could learn, but broadly speaking, I wouldn't want to cross a line of operational independence, and I would want the judgments mainly to be those of individual police officers to be making in the moment about how to educate and explain and engage.
If I may ask you just a little bit further than that, I think the confusion is about whether or not it was ever unlawful for those children to be out playing in the first place, or whether children playing out and about were exercising and therefore had a reasonable excuse not to be at home. So even before we come to the discretion of individual police officers or individual police forces about how they enforce, there was a lack of clarity about whether children playing was unlawful or not. Is that something that the Home Office was worried about?
I mean, clearly everyone who was engaged on this in the Home Office knew how important play was for children, and I imagine that the issues weren't about the precise drafting of the regulations. They were to do with social distancing and things like that. And I imagine that in future we would want to make clear that it would be possible to have a much more liberal interpretation of whatever the regulations or guidance in the future are, in order to allow that play to continue.
Thank you, Sir Matthew. You have been kind enough throughout your evidence to give us your overall reflections and your recommendations for the future. So I don't have any questions to ask you about that. But is there anything that you would like to add about what the Home Office perspective is on what might be done better, specifically with regard to children in the event of a future pandemic?
No, other than to pay tribute to my colleagues in the department and in all of the sectors that they worked with for making an intolerably difficult position better than it otherwise would have been.
Thank you, Sir Matthew. My lady, those are all my questions, and there are no questions on behalf of call participants. Do you have any questions?
No, I don't. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Matthew. And we finished on my hobby horse, so that makes me even happier. Thank you very much indeed for the help you've given, and for the colleague, or your former colleagues, because I don't think you're at the Home Office anymore, are you? Your former colleagues at the Home Office who obviously helped you in preparing for the evidence you've given today. It's been very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, my lady.
Very well. I shall return at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
All rise.